Very good morning, distinguished guests and dear friends. Welcome to the Goethe Institute Max Müller-Bavard. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Notes from the Digital Underground by Khoj, conceptualized with Mila T Samdub and hosted here at the Goethe Institute Max Müller-Bavard. Khoj and MMB share the curiosity to understand the impact of rapidly evolving technologies on various levels, from the individual to the world at large. This convening invites us to look beneath the surface of our networked lives, to pay attention to the hidden infrastructures, to quiet resistances, and alternative digital practices that shape our societies today. Debates around data governance, AI regulation, digital public infrastructures, and the growing impact of algorithmic systems are reshaping how we understand autonomy, transparency, and participation. So I look very much forward to this exchange on critical questions around access, agency, and surveillance, questions of digital sovereignty, ethical AI, and the responsibilities of platforms and states in a hyper-connected environment. As we find ourselves at the intersection of innovation and introspection, where technologies reveal both their brilliance and their shadows, this event invites us to inhabit this intersection with curiosity and with care. It asks us to attend to what usually escapes the spotlight: the informal networks, the subversive gestures, the creative reroutings that resist easy categorization. Notes from the Digital Underground brings these concerns into a creative and critical space. It reminds us that beneath official narratives and dominant platforms, there exist parallel digital cultures like informal networks, experimental practices, and voices that challenge or reimagine the technological systems we take for granted. So I'm very confident that the 4 panel discussions and 3 keynote presentations today and tomorrow will help illuminate these undercurrents, offering new ways of sensing, understanding, and intervening in the digital worlds we inhabit. So thank you to Khoj. A dear and big applause to Khoj for this thoughtful and urgent concept. And of course, to all of you for being part of this shared inquiry. And now it's my big pleasure to invite you, Pooja Sood, founding member and director of Khoj International Artists Association, to commence this convening. Pooja.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Notes from the Digital Underground. Thank you so much, Marla, for giving this introduction. It makes my introduction even shorter. For those of you who followed Khoj's work over the years, must know that one of our core commitments has always been to stay attentive to the world around us, to listen closely not only to our immediate context, but also to the wider forces shaping our lives. This attentiveness has guided our programs and inquiries, leading us to engage with urgent concerns of our times, including ecology and gender. And these have long formed 2 of our central thematic anchors of Khoj's practice. Over the years, we began to feel the growing need to articulate a third core, one that is now inseparable from how we think, live, organize, and imagine our futures. And of course, that's technology. Within the Indian context, there remains an absence of sustained collective engagement with rapidly evolving technologies, particularly from a critical and artistic perspective. And this is often due to limited resources and a lack of institutional support for technology-driven artistic and research practices. As a result, many practitioners work in isolation, driven by deep commitment, but very few opportunities to share, collaborate, or build long-term ecosystems. And this is where Khoj seeks to intervene. We try very hard to create conditions for collaboration, bringing artists and technologists together, It's a difficult one. And nurturing a shared space where both high-tech and low-tech practices can coexist and learn from one another. Over the past decade, Khoj's programming has explored questions around mediality, new media, algorithmic conditions, digital aesthetics, amongst others, and of course the role of artists as witnesses with increasingly technocratic systems. At present, our focus has sharpened around the relationship between technology, the human body, and societies. At a time when machine-driven decisions and data extraction are intensifying long-standing inequities, especially for marginalized communities, we believe it is vital for artists to interrogate these tensions and imagine more empathetic and accountable futures. Since 2023, Khoj has been part of Bodies Machines Publics Network, something that for 2 years, which we got a grant from Pro Helvetia, we're very grateful to. Thank you so much. In collaboration with partners in Chile and Switzerland, which was NAVE in Chile, Kornhaus Forum, and the Immersive Art Space at ZHDK. Thank you, Chris. You're here for that. This collaboration resulted in 2 residencies at Khoj, bringing together artists from Chile, India, Switzerland, and more recently, the UK and Netherlands. Together, we asked some fundamental questions. How is technology embedded in our everyday lives? How does it shape our bodies, our societies, and our planet? This has, of course, culminated in the exhibition, Are You Human?, which opened yesterday at Khoj Studios and the DLF Avenue. We really invite you all, for those who have not been there, to spend some time. This inquiry also led us to today's symposium, convened in collaboration with Mila, who's hiding in the corner there, Mila T Samdub. And here we hope to unpack the digital as it exists in India today, in all its complexity and contradiction. The symposium begins from the recognition that the digital is not experienced equally in India. In India, the internet is shaped by stark differences in access, power, language, labor, and visibility. And over the next 2 days, we want to sit with those uneven conditions to ask how digital systems enable connection while also producing new forms of exclusion, control, vulnerability. By bringing many people here together, artists, technologists, activists, and scholars, we hope to create a space for shared reflection and collective response to the pressures of our digital moment. Essentially, this symposium is about building critical discourse that can help us make sense of the vast and overwhelming spectrum of digital life, and about opening up new ways of thinking, imagining, and acting. We hope these conversations will deepen understanding and also provoke new questions and possibilities. Before we begin, I would like to extend our sincere thanks to Goethe Institute, of course, which is a long-standing partner and a really, really, really precious one. Also, another very long-standing partner, Shergill Sundaram Arts Foundation, which has always stood by us and has been there over the years. The British Council and Pro Helvetia New Delhi for their generous support. I would like to acknowledge the teams both at Goethe and at Khoj, and the individuals whose collaborations have made this symposium possible. We are also grateful to the Taiwan Economic and Culture Center in India, the Taiwan Ministry of Culture, the Australian Culture Forum, and the Federal Ministry for Housing, Arts, Culture, Media and Support of the Republic of Austria. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. We request that you keep your phones on silent, please, and avoid taking calls during sessions. Members of the Khoj team are around and present throughout the space and can be identified with the badges or not. I'm sure you know them by now. Should you need any assistance, there are breaks, as you know. We will start with the keynote, and then there will be a panel and then lunch. So there are many breaks, and so if you wish to step out, please do so during the breaks. It is my pleasure to invite our speakers for the first keynote session. The keynote will be delivered by Chris Salter, who is a professor for immersive arts and director of the Immersive Art Space at the Zurich University of Arts. He is also the Professor Emeritus Design and Computational Arts at Concordia University in Montreal, and the former co-director of the Hexagram Network for Research, Creation, Arts, Culture and Technology. The co-founder of the, excuse my pronunciation, Milieu Institute at Concordia. Salter has given several talks, written several books, all of which you could find in his bio in the little booklet that we have. Welcome, Chris. The keynote will then be followed by a response by Ashish, Rajadhyaksha. Ashish is an old friend and is a film historian, philosopher, and an occasional art curator, is what he says. But I think he does more than occasional. He is the author of the Encyclopedia of Indian cinema at the time of cellulite, from Bollywood to Emergency, and Hackers and other books. He recently curated Dunya Parchiyon Ki at Archila, Delhi. This is again a very short bio. I'm sure for all of you, you could read that. Welcome, Chris, and look forward to your presentation. You want to read this, or you just start?
No, I just start. Yeah, this is super. Let me start my timer. Thank you so much, Pooja, and all the whole Khoj team for the invitation to speak here today. As you've heard over the last 2 years, and thanks to the support of Prohivetsia, as well as the CHTK, we've been very lucky in Switzerland to collaborate with Khoj together and to explore this general topic of bodies, machines, and publics. And that's very much about this kind of question about how new sensing and capture technologies transform the ways we move through and act on and in the world. We're just having a switch over here again. So, as you know, first, we walk around in the world, and sensors are capturing everything we do, from what we breathe to what we eat to what we see to how we walk and so on. And so what I want to talk about, and these maybe perhaps to set certain themes in the air that will come up during the next 2 days, as well as some of the emerging work that's coming out of the immersive art space on the context of what is called extended reality, and of course, being in India already feels like an extended reality, it's a different world than Zurich. And this has to do with the question of how we make sense, or what's called sense making in embodied theories of action within the technologically mediated conditions that we live in today. And specifically, it has to do with the introduction of new technologies, which of course are relatively not new, which are so-called head-mounted displays. You've seen this. This is the Apple Vision Pro, and this is the Meta Quest 3. And these are virtual reality headsets. So basically you put this thing on, and if you've never experienced this, you put this device on, and you are surrounded essentially from the periphery of your vision to the front with computer-generated images as well as audio. And this blocks out the real world, the physical world we're in. It creates a completely imaginary, synthetic world. And what's interesting is that more recently, in the last couple of years, these technologies, these headsets, have had cameras built into them. And what's interesting is these cameras start to bring the real physical world into this so-called virtual world inside this headset. And that's quite interesting because it recenters the experience of the world not on the image or on the artificial sound, but on the body that wears this device. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And these bodies become mediators between themselves, others, and the world they're in. And I want to look at a particular technology which may be familiar to some of you and maybe not to others, which is an optical technology and a set of algorithms in these headsets, which is called video pass-through. You see this image here of this real environment of this house with this television, and then you see some weird kind of blobby-like thing floating in the air in front of you. And with this pass-through technology, the wearers then have to suddenly navigate two spaces simultaneously. They have to navigate essentially a computational world, which is this image you see here, and they have to navigate this so-called real world, which is delivered from this video camera. And so you're in two spaces at once in some ways. Now, this is what I call a sensing machine. This is a book from 22 from the MIT Press that's very nicely sitting in Khoj in the cafe. This sensing machine is a kind of way that sensing hardware and software and our perception and action processes bring about meaning in relationship to each other, okay? And what I want to explore is how this human and this non-human machine sense and what we call in science and technology studies co-produce each other. This means that the human and the machine are less in an adversarial relationship to each other and more in one of mutually shaping the way both perceive and act on the world. So what I'm going to do is talk about three things. One is kind of a bit of context of where this comes from in terms of the site, which is the Immersive Art Space. The second is a bit of the context of a big research project that's bringing a lot of this into play. And the last is some practical examples from an aesthetic point of view. And what I want to hope to do is to convince you that the term technology on the one side and the term society on the other are not mutually exclusive and fixed, but actually are historically contingent and always changing and in the process of emerging, that these are not separate categories. They're actually already in relationship to each other. All right, so as I said, there's three parts. So the first part I want to talk about is just a little bit about the immersive art space, just to give you a bit of a context of what's going on. So this is the Zurich University of the Arts, the ZHDK, or ZHDK. It's the largest art school in Switzerland, one of the largest in Europe. And this is the immersive art space. The immersive art space is basically a large-scale black box. This is actually a project from Pro Helvetia, Argentina, with artist Joaquina Sagado, who came to work with us. And it's essentially a space. It's cross-departmental. It means different departments can come together for teaching, research, and production around this notion of immersion. Immersion, we can just say very quickly, is the relationship to the human body between and the particular environment that it's in. And immersion comes back from the Latin, which means immersio, means to dip into, to dive into. And we're interested in what's called a critical technical practice, which means that one foot is in critique and one foot is design in that sense. And so we're trying to look at technologies through art and design, but also art and design through technological frameworks. And there's a bunch of people that works for it. People come from interaction design, game design, media arts, film production, computer science, fundraisers, senior researchers, PhD students. So it's a culture in some ways that we're building. That's the space. It's a very large black box with motion capture and 3D sound and computers and so on. And when I say this critical technical practice is very much to reflect on the assumptions of these technologies, which we seem to think fall from the sky, and their values, what underlies their values and their use. And we produce different outputs, academic, artistic, and tools. And we have research programs, teaching, and service and production. So I want to, these are some projects that have been shown in various places. I'll talk more about them later. This is a kind of workshop on this project, Probing XR's Futures, which is the basis of this talk. So there's various projects that are in different contexts and museums and exhibitions in the university and outside. Okay, now the context of this discussion comes from a Swiss National Science Foundation project, which is currently undergoing, which is trying to understand what are the technical, social, aesthetic repercussions of these extended reality technologies. So this term XR is essentially an umbrella term for computer-generated environments, access and experience through these headsets, or also through body-based interfaces. And as I said, these are either simulated inside this headset, this called virtual reality, or they're overlaid between the real environment and the digital environment. This was originally called augmented reality. These different terms are being thrown about all the time. But much of the research in these technologies has been driven by psychology and also by engineering, and they're very much this idea that these technologies are somehow given and that you just adapt to them. And of course, they're built so your perception adjusts to them. And what we want to say is that these technologies are cultural. They are part of the tools by which culture is formed, reproduced, and changed. They're not simply tools or machines. Now, there's our friend, Mr. Zuckerberg. So this is to counter this idea that comes from Silicon Valley that companies like Meta, which of course has just said the metaverse, that they changed their name from Facebook to Meta, doesn't pay off. So now it's time to go to AI, But you notice XR, AI, they're all acronyms. They're all 2-letter acronyms. So come up with a new one next. This is to counter this idea that these technologies come from Silicon Valley. Okay, they come from different places. So let's do some genealogical work. Oh, the image is just... Okay, so let's just do some historical work very quickly. Okay, so in 1961, a long time ago, 2 electrical engineers from the American electronics manufacturer Philco developed one of the world's first HMDs, head-mounted displays. And this was called HeadSight. And what this was a system that had a, this is kind of amazing, remote-controlled video camera, that's that thing in that box, mounted on a motorized gimbal that basically could remotely broadcast a live image from its camera to this strange device. And this strange device has essentially a CRT monitor, which basically then used some mirrors that essentially gave the impression that the image that the viewer was seeing was actually in front of them. And when the wearer would move their head in XYZ axis, they would control that remote camera, and that remote camera would turn. And so basically, that camera would be far away from the headset wearer, or they would use radio to broadcast this video signal. And thus, the head and the eyes of the wearer and the camera would be in, the image is kind of flashing it on, off and off, would be in lock, synchronized with each other. Okay. Now, in this sense, that this HeadSight system interfaced with the wearer in a kind of feedback loop, very cybernetically influenced feedback loop of this closed-circuit television system. It augmented the human viewer's optical sensing capacities for the purpose of remotely perceiving hazardous environments. This was the idea. In fact, the designers suggested that the use of the system would basically be used to, quote, explore ocean depths, space, or radioactive areas, unquote. But they also proposed another application, that of what they said military control surveillance. And that was the idea that a camera could be mounted in a rocket or a drone, this is 1961, so that the wearer could have, quote, the sense of being in the drone and survey remote areas in complete safety, unquote. Of course, the safety is only from the perceiver, not from where the drone would hit, as we know. So this is very interesting to see already this idea of cameras we have from the first Iraq War, the idea of cameras in these devices, but this was planned much, much earlier on. Now, this was not the last attempt to do such a thing. Inspired by military research taking place at the Bell Helicopter Corporation in the 1960s, the engineer and one of the founders of computer graphics, Ivan Sutherland, developed what he termed also a head-mounted display. Now, at the time, Bell Helicopter, and my godmother worked for this company. It was very interesting. It was a defense contractor. They were utilizing a display that was strapped around the pilot's head, equipped with a head tracking sensor, and also displays, small CRT displays, in front of their eyes, and connected to also a remote control infrared camera. And this was to land helicopters in the dark. This is the era of the Vietnam War. Of course, they were trying to figure out how to land these helicopters in these jungles in Vietnam. And so as the pilot would turn their head, they would see what the camera was seeing from below, and the camera would basically rotate with the head. So this is, again, this idea of the head being synchronized to some device. Sutherland, though, called this not an optical system, but a kinesthetic display, what he developed, which was called this HMD, which is this. This is 1968. This is called the Sword of Damocles. It was a 2-ton structure with tracking sensors hanging above. And as the viewer turned their head, they would essentially see the real environment through these half-silvered mirrors and then some computer-generated object that would change based on their head movement. And Sutherland said this was a body-based interface, a kinesthetic display that would serve as many senses as possible. And he said that the idea would be to insert a computer in the place where the camera would be to enable the engineer to view a mathematical wonderland of their own choosing. Now, this is, again, quite old. Now, you can see maybe from the tone of both of these prototypes, that this deep entanglement with the military and extended reality would continue on into the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And you can see all these images. This is kind of amazing. 682 Tom Furness. You can see all these images basically have these devices, and what are they contextualized by? Well, military use. And in fact, more recently, the Microsoft signed a deal with the U.S. Army to develop a $45 billion deal to develop more augmented reality technologies for simulation, for battlefield simulation. But that project is running aground. And so Ardaryl, which is the company that Palmer Luckey, who is the founder of Oculus, which Facebook bought for $2 billion to develop mixed reality headsets, now is saving with Microsoft. And Ardaryl is, and Palmer Luckey is a kind of right-wing Trump supporter, so it's quite interesting in this way. So 50 years later, a new generation of these HMD technologies would quickly confirm that this conception of this human-machine loop as a cybernetic apparatus connected in the Cold War context was far from being outmoded. So basically in the late 2010s or so, manufacturers like Vuzix, Vario, Meta, Samsung, HTC, and Apple, of course most recently, began the production of wearable HMDs now aimed at consumer gaming and entertainment markets. That's always the history, of course, of technology. They start in the military, then they go to gaming or to entertainment. These devices began to introduce this feature called video pass-through, a technology that uses external cameras built directly into an HMD to capture a real-time video feed of the immediate environment in front of and around the headset, and then display that video to the wearer inside the device. So this is in contrast to the idea of telepresence, which is this first idea from 61, where essentially the device and the camera would be in separate environments. And this aim of pass-through is to seamlessly mix the real world and computer-generated technology or imagery to create this augmented reality. Now, this is kind of pass-through. You have this kind of imaginary world that you're seeing through this device, but you're actually seeing the real world as well. So the interesting question then comes, why does this idea of viewing reality through this mediating system of machine sensing keep appearing again and again? So why does this happen? And we can give three possible answers to this question. The first is this idea of path dependence in economics. And this is this notion that history matters in relationship to technology. So when technological concepts and components and entire systems get locked in from what was successful in the past to determine what happens in the future. So that's one aspect. So a lot of people say, this is so innovative, this is new, but in fact, you look at the history and you see that's already been done. It's just that it's been framed in a different way. Now, the second is this idea, of course, of critical VR studies of surveillance capitalism, and that this is this notion that these headsets are part of a larger data extraction strategy. So companies like Meta have an obsessive focus not about gaming or social interaction, but actually about the data that those devices generate. And there's a lot of sensors in these devices, so they capture a lot of human data. And so basically the idea is that the body now is this kind of wellspring of data, and not just what you type or what you say, but how you move, how fast you move your hand, how fast you turn your head, and so on. So those are two kind of reasons why this maybe has come back. But there's a third reason, and I think this is maybe even more interesting, and that is the idea that these technologies try to reimagine how we think about computers, right? Not computers as kind of boxes, but computers as embedded into the environment. And through the coupling of what we call sensory motor action and these sensing technologies, what this pass-through technology suggests is a new form of understanding how we make sense in a world where computing essentially becomes the environment itself. And this is what has been termed spatial computing. And in fact, I had an interesting discussion at CSDS yesterday with Suvani and Ravi Sundaram about the idea that this pass-through technologies are predominantly visual. And what would you do if you walked around with a headset out into the Indian streets? Because you completely be overwhelmed by the acoustic environment. And this is very interesting. The spatial computing suggests that the computer, quote, retains and manipulates reference to real objects and spaces in the real physical world, but these spaces have prior significance to the user. They're not just imaginary, they're actually, it's a space that you move in every day. It's the term, it actually comes from an MIT Media Lab graduate, Simon Greenwald. He wrote this about 1995 about this idea of the computer as spatial. And he said the spatial computing is to celebrate the corporality of data rather than trying to deny it. In other words, the kind of sense-making that spatial computing paradigms propose is premised on describing computing and sensing systems not simply as data extraction systems, but initiating new forms of activity that both constrain and also open up new connections between human and non-human agencies with machines. So this is very interesting because you can see that this is a complicated situation. It's not simply as data extraction, which is happening, but completely different ways of understanding the world we're in through computational systems. All right, let's take a look now for about 10 minutes about the technologies that underlie this pass-through, because this is what's quite interesting. So in the case of this MetaQuest 3, the pass-through, this video signal is generated by two kinds of sensors. So there's two RGB cameras with relatively wide field of views in the front of the device that sense the environment in color. And then on the side, you have a bunch of cameras, which there are four infrared cameras. And those cameras are designed to figure out where this technology is in space. It uses a technology called SLAM, simultaneous location and mapping, which is predominantly used in robotics for robots to find themselves in spaces, how to track themselves in your living room. Okay. But the cameras are only one part of this pass-through stack. The Quest 3, for instance, features a unique kind of hybrid sensor and actuator. An actuator is different. The sensor captures data, actuator puts energy back into the environment. And it's a depth sensor. And what the depth sensor does is try to look at how far things are from the device. And there's a projector that projects light into the environment, and that it's infrared light. So only the camera can see this. Humans can't see it. And this light hits the surface, and then the depth camera tries to understand how much deformation is happening on the surface from this light. So it's completely, this has happened with the Kinect sensor as well from Microsoft that was used to power the Xbox 360. So what's interesting is there's so much sensing going on in these devices that we have no idea about. And what that then sensor does is try to reconstruct what it sees in software in the device. And this is all worn. This is what's kind of interesting about these technologies. They're all on the body. They're not in a separate box. But what's also revealing is this, so you can see like here the sensors, there's depth sensor, there's RGB camera, there's microphone, which is only for voice, not for the environment. So there's no auditory pass-through. It's really, that's just like if you walk around the street and you want to have a business conversation in your HMD. But what's really interesting is this thing on the right, the IMU. So an IMU is a sensor, is a cluster of sensors. It's called an inertial measurement unit. We've used them a lot. They're used basically for three reasons. They measure the basically acceleration. There's an accelerometer, a magnetometer, and a gyroscope. And they measure essentially how the body moves in space, how fast its angular velocity, how the angle of rotation, acceleration, all these very physical things. And what this sensor does is correct the camera image that we think we're seeing from this device in real time. So we look and we think we're seeing essentially, if I was wearing this device now, I would see all of you up to it's not a perfect image, but it's quite high resolution. But actually that image is being reconstructed. It's because if you saw what the camera saw, it would be completely flipped upside down and twisted, and there would be parallax distortion. And also, if this sensor wasn't there, the image would move so quickly you would get sick. So what this sensor does is essentially cause a friction, a kind of latency, so that the camera image adjusts itself and it's warped around essentially the field of vision. So the technologies underlying this are quite interesting in that way. And that's why, of course, they're extremely expensive, and that's why Meta spent something like $15 billion or $50 billion in the last couple of years to develop these hardware technologies. So the amount of knowledge going into these systems is quite extraordinary. Now, what is interesting is that pass-through then is not only showing a camera image, it's not just a visual technology, it actually is producing what Kevin O'Regan and Alvin Noyes, a cognitive psychologist and a philosopher of language, Noe, termed a sensory motor contingency. And this is the idea that the structure of the rules that govern the sensory changes are produced by moving, by motion. Okay, so this suggests that the body is central to how we perceive the world. It's not just the brain, like we think that AI proposes, and it's neural networks, which are all brains and vats, but it's actually the whole body. Now, what are these sensory motor contingencies? How do they function if we don't wear an HMD? Well, one is if you turn your head, the world rotates with you. It doesn't stay fixed, right? That's one thing. As you get closer to an object, the texture of that object changes. If you're not sight impaired and you blink, suddenly the world disappears for a second, right? So these are all these ideas of sensory motor contingencies. And in the sense that O'Regan and Noe say that seeing, for instance, is a temporally extended pattern of activity. It's a give and take between you and the environment. It's not just in you, it's out in this relation between these two things. Now, what's critical here is that the human body is not a passive object, a source of data, but there's this exchange. There's this constant exchange of energy, of data, but also of meaning production, meaning making between us and then these sensing technologies. And meaning, I don't mean they were conscious, but I mean they were trying to make sense in two ways, both from a human level, but the sensors are also trying to make sense for the human is. So you can see this as a quite complex loop. So we can say that pass-through is incorporating this sensory motor body as an integral part of its sensing system. And this follows earlier historical material developments in vision technologies, of course, predominantly in Europe, like glasses, which the American art theorist Jonathan Crary said these are techniques of visibility. And these techniques of visibility become lodged in an apparatus, which is the body itself, human body itself. So here we have an interesting revelation. This visual technology of the camera is actually rooted in the whole body and not just the eyes. And as I said, that what's happening is essentially there's this reconstruction of what we see taking place. This is what historian of computing James Dobson called the kind of idea that visual technology, the computer vision, actually exceeds our visual capacities. What computer vision algorithms see is completely different than how we imagine vision working. So I hope it's clear by now that vision is only one sense invoked by this visual technology. But let's get back to the initial question: why pass through again, as opposed to and now? So it's interesting. There's two researchers, Michael Saker and Frith, who argue that essentially virtual reality, its history, was not really interested in the real space around us. And they say, but with these pass-through technology, we have this coextensive space, and this is to make a symbiotic relationship between the physical and the digital, which is proximate, meaning it's close to us, extensive, and transformative in this sense. So we create not just a single space, but two spaces overlap with each other. But the problem is that this there's a kind of paradoxical thing with spatial computing. So on the one hand, due to the body being free to interact in these larger physical spaces and to capitalize on our ability to act in the world physically, pass-through, of course, underscores a kind of new degree on the focus of human movement as a technology, right? And this goes. There's lots of arguments about this is that virtual reality or these simpler technologies are basically technological interfaces that create embodied action, and that they present basically the design requirements for how you have to think about these technologies, that we have to think about this wholeness of the body. But the question is this, Anna Munster calls it intensified corporal sensation promised by extended reality, might not apply to all bodies, right? And Puneet Jain will talk about this tomorrow, I think, which is this idea that, for instance, bodies that are disabled don't really work with these technologies. There's an assumption that there's a corporal standard, a kind of ideal non-disabled body that these technologies imagine. So, for instance, with the Oculus HMDs, you have to have these hand controllers. If you don't have hands, that's a problem. If you can't move your body, if you have sensory motor disabilities, if you're in a wheelchair, we're working with a colleague, Christian Bayerlin, who is quadriplegic. He can hardly only move his head. So these technologies are not designed at all for people who cannot stand up. And this suggests that there's this kind of, this is techno-ableism. It's a kind of common sense idea of accessibility. We'll figure out how to solve these problems technically, and that's not the issue. So there's another paradox which is very obvious, which is the political ramifications of spatial computing. So if space becomes the new site for machine sensing and computational processes, which involves what Lucy Suchman and Anna Bazou called the coupling of humans with computational devices taken to extend the body's capacities, native capacities, through information processing, right? If this exists, then it's clear that pass-through is not just an extension, but it creates a new kind of symbiotic relationship between the devices and the persons that are wearing those devices. So it shouldn't come to any kind of surprise that these devices offer up what Jeremy Bailenson called granular information about human bodies, right? So this is this tricky thing because on the one side, these technologies are very much celebrating full bodiness and not just the brain and not just being cognitive. And the other side, of course, bodies now become the site of extraction. So it's this quite the way we start thinking about the physical world we live in, not just a screen and not just carrying a screen around, but really the environment is starting to radically change through these things. And this is highly problematic. Now, despite this kind of increased interest in what Philip Agri called capture technologies. And the interesting thing is that we tend to think that the computers are like surveillance systems. Well, Philip Agri, a computer scientist, and also became kind of a sociologist of technology, argued that machines have to do something called capture. They have to create a representation of the world that they're trying to understand in the machine. And that world is very limited. The kind of grammars of action that the machine constructs are constrained, that do not necessarily fit the range of expression that human bodies have. Now, the other interesting thing is that these HMDs, as you see, most of the images you see people wearing these devices are people alone. And virtual reality has had a long-term problem with what we call the social, right? Because they're very, very solipsistic. They're about like the individual experiencing something on their own. And what is interesting is in kind of theories of embodied action and cognition is a concept called participatory sense making. So what does it mean, sense making? We try to make sense of the world that we're in. We try to move through so for instance, for those of us who are not from India, when we're in India, like making sense is difficult because the models we have, the logics we have from cultural context we come from don't apply. And we know there must be some logic to this self-organization of people driving, for instance, in the street, but we don't know what it is, and so we're trying to make sense. And the arguments of sense-making include the idea that the world is not just already there and we try to make sense of it. We bring it out. We bring forth a world. This is what Francisco Varela said. We bring forth a world through our embodied engagement with that world. And the world includes other people. It doesn't just include us alone sitting with a device. If you saw the original ads for the Apple Vision Pro, all the images show people in these Silicon Valley homes sitting alone watching television and then seeing this virtual world. So it's like, well, what about the other people? Like, they don't exist? So in the last 14 minutes, I'm gonna show you two examples of projects that try to grapple with this, artistic projects that we've developed. But the first, I'm going to propose a kind of speculative situation, and then I'm going to end with these examples. So imagine a group of people wearing these HMDs, okay? And they all have pass-through, and they're all networked, meaning that each person can see the other person from their unique point of view, okay? Now, that sounds completely normal, right? Now, imagine if you don't have that HMD, same thing. The problem is that those technologies, when you put them on, have no idea about your perspective. In other words, there's no world locking, which is an interesting term, where the headsets all share the same coordinate and orientation system. So it's completely crazy. You have to calibrate these technologies so everyone sees the same thing from their perspective. And so otherwise, you will be trying to communicate with someone who's not there. They're on the other side of the room because the calibration has changed. And so this world locking, which we in social situations is completely normal for us as human beings, when you put these technologies on, that completely breaks down. And it's very strange because the problem is all these sensors, they don't have any time code. They don't know how to lock to each other. There's drift going on. There's all these technical changes happening that don't enable these devices to really know anything about who's wearing them or where they're wearing them, what space they're wearing it. You have to do all this stuff to get them to function. And yet, there is this shared reality because people's bodies aren't next to each other, and you see through these cameras other people's bodies. You put your hand there, you know your hand is there. Unlike virtual reality, you have fake hands. And even though you can't see other people's faces, because of course they're wearing this device, but you can look at their gestures. You can look at all sorts of nonverbal things that happen. And sociologists of science have been looking at this idea of, or also like, let's say, interactional linguists have been looking at this question of co-presence, the idea that there are other material bodies around the environment. Now, what kind of sensing situations might be specific to this context? All right, so show you two examples from the immersive art space. The first is a project called Doppelganger that's come out of this research project, and we're kind of showing this at different festivals. And it's developed by one of my colleagues, Chris Leisy and Florian Bergusser. And this is an installation for 4 participants, i.e. the public. Now, what happens is that each person's image is taken with a system that we custom developed, and within 7 seconds reconstructed from a 2D image into a 3D avatar. And 4 participants confront these reconstructions of themselves in a physical space in this kind of strange encounter. And I'm just going to play this video so you can watch this. So this is the initial system where essentially you just take this. This was a camera, but now you just take a photo of this person. This is doing all sorts of kind of computer vision things, pose estimation on all of these techniques that are now very common. And what happens is it reconstructs this body very quickly. It segments it, and it basically builds a moving body. And then it uses a neural network to kind of reconstruct the back. And so all this happens very quickly. It happens within 10 seconds. So that's the technology underlying it. Okay, so here's the video. So this is trying to get at the Freudian uncanny and this kind of digital uncanny, which Chris Rivetto talks about. And so first so this is for 4 people. Maybe we could turn the light down somehow. Yeah, that would be good.
Please hold the line.
Yep, thank you. So
Please hold the line.
So this is for 2 people, but normally it's for 4. So suddenly you appear in this mirror moving. Now you have these, then it does all sorts of weird things because of the glitches in the software and the lighting conditions. And so now so basically you start seeing yourself, and this avatar mirrors you. Now of course they're fixed, they're not moving their lips, and then you see the other person. Yeah, this is strange. And then they start multiplying. So you start being surrounded by yourself. And those other selves start moving on their own volition. And each scene adds more of them. So you see all these doubles of yourself. but you see the other people, but they only see their doubles and they see you. So no one sees everyone's doppelganger until the very end when they all converge on each other. Now, this is very strange because these digital doubles are the same size as you. They're in the same environment. Then it gets more and more kind of crazy. And so people's response to this is quite interesting because they have to navigate both with the physical, with these doppelgangers, but also the physical environment itself, and also their fellow participants. And we've done a lot of video analysis and interviews, and people have comments like, "Oh my God, my doppelganger, get away from me! And this thing is coming at me, and why? What's happening with yours? Because I can't see it." So this, then they all come together in a kind of bizarre blob at the end. You say, "Oh my God, this is like a nightmare. I can't, get away." So, but what's really interesting is that this kind of intensification of movement happens where people start choreographing themselves in very strange relations because they're trying to navigate with these virtual doubles that they see but the others don't. So you have a very strange social choreography going, and this uncanniness keeps multiplying. Now, what's interesting is that one of the ideas of presence in virtual reality is the idea of the illusion of non-mediation. That means that you forget you're wearing this technology. But of course, any media scholar will say this is completely crazy because this entire situation is constructed technologically. It would not be possible. You would not have you see yourself in a mirror, but the mirror, of course, doesn't have an autonomy outside of your own movement, right? It mirrors you, but it doesn't do anything different. So that's one example of trying to understand what happens when you introduce this computational complexity in a physical space and how then people socially navigate it. All right. The second example in the last 3 minutes is kind of work in progress. And this is really work in progress, and these are just tests. And the question we start with is, how do we make sense in a social context with others inside this mixed context? And here we move to a very different form of aesthetic form. The first one is very much coming from kind of game design. And this is stranger. This is a kind of post-war minimalism. So we're inspired by some ideas coming from the American visual artist Robert Irwin, who passed away last year, who was working in the so-called light space movement with people like Maria Nordman and Douglas Wheeler, James Turrell in the 60s. And then they were very interested in, like, how do we perceive ourselves sensing? And then we're also looking at the work of Bruce Nauman, of course, especially these works which were very much kind of endurance rituals for the public. This is a project called Body Pressure, where you press your whole body against a wall. And then the final thing is the work of Arakawa Gins, to Japanese and American artists who were interested in the question of how do physical surroundings invite bodily action, and they created these very strange environments to try to throw off sensory routine. And what I'm going to show you is just a 1-minute clip of just a test with a colleague who's very well known here. She's from here. I won't say who it is. Some might recognize the voice. And her class was visiting from the big technical university, the ETH, in Zurich, and they were architects. So it's very interesting to see this. And so this is kind of taking this Robert Irwin work, the Homage to the Square, which was in the Dia Center in the 1990s, and putting this in a virtual physical space. And there's a bunch of different scenes. We've edited this, but what's interesting is to listen to the response of this person who's with her students. Oh, can we turn the volume up again? I don't hear it, I think.
Oh yeah, faint screen.
Oh yeah, here, I'll start again. Okay, so this is the immersive art space. She asks, what is anything happening?
Oh yeah, faint screen.
So there's a screen. This screen changes its opacity over 10 minutes.
It's feeling so real now, this, I mean, so non-virtual, relatively speaking. Oh, now it's getting spatialized
So now people are in this kind of Irwin-like space.
very quickly.
And they're wearing
It
microphones.
can feel like you're stuck in a room.
So don't feel stuck in a room.
Oh, I see. This is like slightly unnerving.
So then they
Okay,
walk
now
out
go
of it.
back. Okay. Oh, I see. Oh, now I can see you and hear you.
So, for instance, you can only hear the
Oh,
people
because we're in the same space.
who are close to you. When
But
they
now-
go away, you can't hear them.
Ooh, all four in the same room.
Suddenly, all these people are in the same room, right? Who questions what room are they in? Then the walls start to flicker. So you start seeing like doubles of people, and then you see where they are, but you can't acoustically
Basically,
locate them.
If you leave the white line, the white square, then there's no audio.
And then these kind of strange things become these rotating fans, like revolving doors, and you can see people respond as if they're there.
Oh, that's a fast one.
So this is fast.
And it's the same thing.
Then it
Oh,
gets stranger.
I see one on the other side too. Yeah, now they're coming at us. It's like silk and tar and water and oil at the same time. Okay, I'm gonna try this. Oh, it's physically painful to stand in it. Oh, it feels like it's rising.
So this thing keeps
It's
closing
just
in.
getting closer. Okay, it stopped. Oh, the texture's changed. Oh. It's a whole new world.
Okay, so to finish, so what kind of sense making is taking place here? Well, first, it depends on whether one knows the others or not. That's the first thing. Second, it's also clear that the environment, what is the environment? It's a technical construction because there's no physical environment that could behave in this way, right? Three, the sense making, which is usually dyadic, thought about as two people, suddenly becomes a group, and it's multimodal. The sense making is happening through gesture, distance between each other, so-called interpersonal distance, vocal sounds, movement, and not through kind of simple conversation. And as we understand now that from like machines like language models, it's really much different because it's happening at these other levels. And it's constantly shifting. The fourth and most important is that the participants are navigating computationally constructed spaces, but they behave as if these spaces were really there. And this is very strange because you're like, I'm behaving like I'm in the world, but it's something I'm also navigating myself around things which are only at the front of my face. And in fact, in a survey we gave them, we asked, where do you think you are in terms of this environment? They said, we're in the immersive art space. We're not in these virtual spaces, which would be very different if you asked them in VR where they were. And so we might try to look at this situation through what the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon called its technicity, its technical nature. And this term suggests that every technical object or system has what Simondon called a kind of concretization. It's how this technology, like a biological system, evolves, it's how it serves different functions, and how it interacts harmoniously with other elements, like a biological system does. So in other words, the technologies for Simondon, they create their own milieu, their own site, and within these, their own connections, rules, and norms for co-producing the reality that we understand. So in this sense, we might get a sense of this kind of human and non-human computational world through the specific technical actions of the system. And I'll say the system could be both the humans and the techniques. And this is in order to pave the ground for describing and reflecting on the kinds of human experience that such a more than human system enables. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks, Pooja, for press ganging me into what is clearly a formidable task as I try to do my best to respond. Two things very quickly. One, there is a technology, and there's obviously something awe-inspiring about it. But I mean, being a film studies person, I know, and Chris will of course confirm, that back in the late 19th century, very similar claims were made about another technology, the wonder of the century, the marvel of the world. And there was a similar kind of anxiety almost exactly 125 years ago. So one of the things that we learn from Chris's work is that very often there's nothing new in what we've encountered. There is prehistory, there are earlier contexts within which this can be made sense of. Just want to say two things. One is that, when you spoke about pass-through, you were speaking about, what did you say, wearers increasingly navigating through two spaces simultaneously, a computationally shaped space, and at the same time, a phenomenally experienced physical world. Now, there are two spaces, and as a result, there are, as the doppelganger suggests, two selves associated with those two spaces. And I want to go a little bit into, again, using a proposition you had made, the politics of it. So I will do a little bit about keeping the technology aside for the moment and going into a relatively more, shall we say, familiar zone, the political, and some of the consequences of it. This idea of two spaces and this doppelganger is something that I want to suggest is a confrontation or a conversation taking place within an ecological moment that the planet is in, which is clearly at a tipping point. We are encountering a certain kind of ecological environmental crisis within which this is made sense of, as the second of the two examples more or less provides. So in that context, I want to ask a few questions. I want to say one other thing, which is that I actually met Chris for the first time virtually day before yesterday or the day before that, and which was the time when I learned for the first time what he was going to be talking about, which is also not what he's actually spoken about. So I am improvising in real time with this thing. But what did happen was that a month and a half ago, when Pooja asked me to do this, I used Anna's archive and downloaded 3 of your books, Entangled, Alien Agency, and the Censor's book. And I was reading those with some interest, and I was actually trying to pose my questions to the Chris in my head, Chris in my whatever that gear that you wear, and coming up with questions that I thought you might potentially ask. I'm glad to say that from Entangled through to Alien Agency, through to the Censor's book, through to what you have presented today, there is a continuity. And so I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and expand my my questions, 4 of them actually, to not only what Chris spoke about today, but what he has been writing about as well, because I think there's a connection. So let me start with this question of the doppelganger and the you, and let's say there is maybe this is even not exactly right, but imagine that I am in wearing this device, and there is a me, let's say there's a you, and there is an it, which is the digitally, technologically enhanced version of you, right? It's astonishing how simple questions like, are you it? Do you want to become it? Or are you apprehensive of becoming it? Do you define it? Or does it define you? What happens if you fail to become it? What happens if the relationship between you and it is snapped? There's a little bit of a pun there, which is that in India, we have the word other rhymes very quickly with the word Aadhar. And there is an actual situation which the Supreme Court of India talked about when it had the dissenting judgment on Aadhar as to what happens when you and it are snapped. The possibility that if your digital avatar, to use the phrase you had, which is actually the kind of data that the state gathers around you, disconnects with who you are as a person, there can be a condition that he described as civil death, the dissenting judgment, and it could actually lead to physical death. It can be a situation where, contrary to those who claim privacy, the dependence that we have on our doppelganger is actually a matter potentially of life and death. And to that extent, it associates with things like civil rights. And there would be a whole series of incredibly complicated political questions associated with this, which is what I want to talk about. So, the idea of doppelganger, to use a very much more famous version of it by Naomi Klein, is actually both the desired and the terrorizing other. And two things that happened with Chris's argument, I think one is that I think Chris consistently talks about the larger political ramifications of this, not so much in today's presentation, although you suggested it, but in your earlier work, as well as, of course, the importance of the fact that there are historical precedents to this. As you say, for example, in Alien Agency, this question, the questions that we are talking about, of even this pass-through, doesn't come out of nowhere. It is situated in a larger, almost seismic shift that you have talked about that is taking place across many disciplines, practices and sites, across the university and the museum, the festival, the scientific laboratory and the street. And in that big context, and I think this is the way the Khoj also wants to frame this, all these different sites where these confrontations are happening, that I want to talk about 4 concepts and I'll leave it at that. The first is to do, again, with your earlier work, where you talk about the replacement of representation with performativity. That's an important one, I think. That's something that I need to think about. I have sometimes thought about the way that representation defined the 20th century, the idea of political representation, self-representation, representation, all these concepts define the 20th century. And I have thought that simulation defines the 21st. And there is, of course, this element of performativity that you have come across, which is quite important. And also because a very important part of what you have done over your body of work is to really bring many of these questions into science and technology studies. And what does performativity do in science has been a question that he has talked about. Chris speaks about how performance has a mode of being in the world, and of course there's clearly a lot of performance going on even in the examples you've given, radically differs from representational forms of knowledge. Now this is a big deal. Are we looking at something that's fundamentally different from what representation was? I think this is of relevance even to some of the artworks that I saw yesterday at Khoj. Are these works performing or are they representing? Are we talking about the end of representation? I think sometimes artists would, perhaps without necessarily figuring out the consequences, say, yes, that is true. I am post-representation. I'd like us to think about the consequences of it. Mainly because you say that if representation spoke about imitation of the idea of a given world that existed outside, you say what performance's method and worldview suggests is that there is not a reality pre-given before one's experience, but rather that the world is enacted or actively performed anew, right? So there is no world preceding, or there's no imagination of the world preceding your specific encounter of it. Now, I think this has got consequences. The political consequences of it are the possibility of the future. Are we seeing the death of the future? The capacity of the imaginability of what the future holds. If that is gone, and if you're actually encountering everything in real time, then what does this do to one's political sense of what the directionality of where we are going is? Are we, in a way, in some kind of a dance of death spiraling downwards with our other? We and our doppelganger in this kind of crisis. The related second point is something that you've talked about on occasion, where you talk about science. I talk about, in fact, how science needs to be seen less, I'm quoting you here, as a project of pre-given representations that can be conveniently packaged into what we call knowledge, and more an entire system of apparatuses, and this comes in today's presentation also, machines and instruments and infrastructures that are partially responsible for facilitating human science's production of knowledge and facts, where science is not about nature, but rather a fierce fight to construct reality. I'm interested in the idea of that fierce fight to construct reality. I'd like to know who the antagonists in that particular fierce fight are. I can see the disciplines, but what then is this fight to construct reality? I mean, I suspect that's going on in Minneapolis right now, the fierce fight to construct reality, and the technological consequences of it, for example, would be there. My third point is this, I think for me, the really important argument, which was not so much present in this presentation, but you said you could talk about it, the post-human or the postmodern. The post-human, I think, is an interesting one. I'm going, there are elements of the ecological disaster or the ecological crises we are in, and why Dipesh Chakravarti, for example, says that the word Anthropocene is a misnomer. You shouldn't call it that. Mainly because if human beings are the reason for why the crisis happened, then the human beings, A, are not a solution to that problem, but B, the anthropocenic, the anthropo-centered way of looking at it may actually not be the way of seeing it at all. So he was talking about other ways by which you might speak about it, which actually brings the non-human into play, which is very, very central to this. I mean, as a follower of Latour, which you quote extensively, you speak about actor networks, actants, and this idea of an agency of actants rather than human actors spread out among multiple associations and network connected with each other in a skein of relations and transforming each other through such relations. Again, Susan is here, and they have this wonderful database on Delhi that happened in the events of 2019-20, which I think may open up these kinds of questions, even as political questions, in looking at what happened in Northeast Delhi at that time, and the kind of technological processes that were in there. This is, as you say, this has the effect of quickly bringing us back to well-trodden postmodern oppositions between live versus mediated, or presence versus absence. The discourse becomes, in a way, the ocular-centered one of image representation, thus ignoring other senses like touch, hearing, taste, or smell. That, what we really need to figure out is the whole question about the situated action, whether originating in human beings, in machines, or materials that occur in a concrete real-world context at a particular time and place versus, and this is a new space that we're in, and anytime, any place simulation, such as what takes place in online environments. So that is another kind of question about what the spatiality of this is. I'll conclude with this other thing about the human question. I'll have a longish quotation here, which I really like. Where you talk about rights. It's an interesting one. I mean, what do rights do to this? I mean, I was mentioning to you yesterday about one of our leading human rights scholars in India, Upendra Bakshi, who has written this very interesting book called Human Rights in a Post-Human World. I mean, what does human rights do to the condition of the post-human? You mention, and this is a big thing in your argument, that the divide between nature and culture, or the divide between human and non-human, is a human construct. In a way, the non-human may not actually have any distinction between nature and culture. And in nature and culture, of course, this other question about how culture, appropriates, transforms nature. At one point of time, you say, and this is where I want to take issue with you, that you say, despite my strong focus on material action, I do not want to conveniently defer all rights onto the non-human in order to shirk human responsibility. And you quote someone whom I used to know, Mike Fisher, who actually says that the human condition may actually still have a future. Now, that could well be a liberal dream. that Mike Fisher and yourself can continue to believe in, but I strongly suspect that we are past that moment. I want to suggest with Dipesh Chakravarti, for example, who actually has a really interesting take on this Anthropocene about, he says, I'm quoting him here, we are as a species defined purely by survival, turning into a mode of existence that is collectively and as a geophysical force indifferent or neutral to questions of intrahuman justice. I'd like your response to that, because you do go into this thing about the intrahuman in the. But if we collectively, I'm quoting Dipesh here, have also become a geophysical force, then we also have a collective mode of existence that is, he says, justice blind. Call that a mode of being a species or something else, but it has no ontology. I lost my connection here, sorry. It has no ontology, it is beyond biology, he says. These were some of the questions that I think arose as a result of Chris's wonderful work over the years in these books I'm talking about, and may be of relevance to this presentation as well as to some of the concerns of this conference. Thank you.
That was a lot, Ashish. Where do we start? Maybe the last question about rights. It's interesting because so there was a debate in science studies. Feminist STS scholar Monica Kaspar wrote in response to Latour a long time ago about this idea of the non-human. And she said, well, this is, of course, this is a politically framed question because she was discussing the issue of abortion rights in the US. So it says, when is it important to invoke the non-human? And when is it politically advantageous and when is it not? And one of the arguments, certainly from feminist scholars, STS scholars, has been that who decides what this non-human is, you know, and this is why now, of course, it's not non-human, but it's more than human, and it becomes somehow, let's say, convenient in a legal position to deny essentially the human motivation or human action, and by essentially transferring the rights onto non-human. You know, so for instance, there was a massive accident when I was in Brazil in 2015, and with a a mine that exploded and polluted this one river, and there was a discussion. I can't remember who was in this discussion, but saying, well, you know, the river is assigned the rights, you know. So then the question is, well, who's responsible then? Because the river, of course, can't go into the court. You know, it has no legal responsibility for what it's done. And this is now, we can say the same thing with AI. I mean, the whole debates around AI, so-called AI ethics and alignment, all that. Well, we just conveniently transfer the rights of the human ethical problems to the AI. The AI has to be, has to align itself and but without, again, thinking whether there's human engineers designing these systems, So there is this. Certainly, as you bring it up, there's a certain strong tension between this division between there's the human world and then there's, of course, the more than human world of these of animals, plants, the biotic world, and then there's also the technical world. But the biotic world, of course, has internal motivations for survival, right? The technical world doesn't yet, which is, of course, and I say yet, it's problematic yet. So, who then becomes big debates now about should AI have rights, which is I understand the question, but it gets a bit absurd to think, okay, we're in this situation now where we're asking, does the robot, we were talking about in the car earlier, the robot have rights? You know, if the human caretaker with the robot, otherwise kids will jump on it and destroy it when it's cleaning a space, you know, public space. So we're in this strange situation where we're aware of this increasing displacement of the human through this bio and technical world, which is increasingly mixing together. But at the same time, we of course, as you bring up, you know, we're also the ones constructing the problem from the start. From the start. So there's a lot of work, of course, of artists as well, you know, talking about this non-human, more than human world, and there's a kind of romanticization of it, you know, which again, of course, that's not the intention, but it somehow tries to get away from the problem, which is, okay, what is this? That's why I use this term co-production. What is this production happening between these things, as opposed to like, they're symmetrical, they're on the same wavelength, you know, and Latour and others were criticized for this kind of so-called flatness, you know, of these things being on the same plane. And I think that's the problem, because as many people say, well, especially critics of this kind of actor network or this kind of flat ontology say, there are different motivations, you know, and humans have different motivations than machines and plants and animals. And so, yeah. And so this motivation question comes into play all the time, which is like, why did someone design this system to do what it does in the way it does it, which we then may find problematic, or at the same time, we may find that that system does something that we did not expect, you know, surprise, curiosity, all these things that people imagine the technical systems, for instance, will do. So I guess part of what I was trying to point out is these are not simple questions. They're contingent. They're constantly changing based on the action or the circumstances or the context by which they're being posed in, as opposed to being ontologically somehow above those contexts. You know, that's why I talk in this talk about like pass through. This is a very specific technology, right? It has very specific material conditions, has historical conditions, and that's how we have to approach it, rather than kind of a blank idea that there's this, you know, there's some kind of ontological superiority over, like there's a human and a non-human, and then they're somehow, you know, equally important. That's not the case. Sometimes the non-human is less important than the human, and sometimes the human is less important than the non-human. So yeah.
There's much to say, but maybe
we can
10 minutes.
Yeah.
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 Is someone moderate? Sorry.
Yes, I think there's probably a question.
Hi, thanks for the lovely talk. I'm an anthropologist, so my question is coming from that way.
Okay, great.
So the discussion, like the transformation of physical space, reminded me of the ritual discussions that has been happening in anthropology.
Yeah.
So I was reminded of Marilyn Statton's example, where she meditates on a feather in a collective dance, and the feather is waving and the space gets transformed due to the ritual, right? So
Thanks. Yeah.
for me, the kind of transformation you were talking about was less about technology, but more about individuals' power to conduct that transformation. Can you elaborate on that? Because, like, for example, even a simple home, in an Indian home, within a ritual setting, transforms into something else.
Yeah.
So can you comment more on the individuating nature of the technologies that you were mentioning?
Yeah.
And like Ashish said, like they have certain political consequences that are severe, that can be very detrimental. So if you can elaborate on that, that will be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because, as you say, that when you in those kinds of tests I was showing, when people put these devices on, they don't know what to do. It's very different than rituals, where there's a clear sense of action that takes place. We do this because this has significance. This action has a significance. This action has a significance. This transforms a space in a particular way for whatever spiritual purposes, or for domestic purposes, or whatever. But those technologies don't, you know, they somehow come prepackaged with an assumption of how they're supposed to be understood and how they're supposed to be used. You know, you're supposed to move your hands this way, you're supposed to turn your head this way, you're supposed to walk this way. The sensing technologies condition those kinds of actions, you know. But of course, they also become very, if you're in those, you can't wear these headsets for more than 20 or 30 minutes because you get tired, you know, your vision gets tired, the image is too close, you know. But in fact, of course, as you say, from a ritual perspective, rituals go on for hours, if not days, you know. I mean, think about the 49 days after death in Tibetan Buddhism, where the Bardo Toda is read, you know, to the ear of the corpse. And so these things go on days and days and days. And that's very interesting to think about what would happen if people start to not live in these technologies in a kind of domestic way, like I'm doing my computing, I'm doing my grocery shopping, I'm doing, that's what they want. They want people to work, you know, like to sit there with a big screen in the air and you know, interact with it. So this kind of durational experience that we have in life is short-circuited by this technical, you know, constraints in that way. But what would it mean for people then to start wearing these? So part of this project, we're also trying to investigate what happens when groups of people go out into public space and sit in a restaurant where they eat for 2 or 3 hours with these technologies. We haven't done this yet, but even walking in the street and asking people for directions. So what, you know, what, and then this one, in my colleague Philip Sermani, someone asked him, what can you see, what do you see? And he said, I see everything. He said, well, why are you wearing the technology? Why are you wearing this device? So I think a lot of it has to do with this durée, you know, this sense of something that's over time, that's very difficult at this moment because of these constraints. And so the integration of them into a particular kind of understanding of space, which has a long durée, is difficult in a sense. I don't know if that answered the question, but it is a very interesting question about like the preparation of space and how it's structured.
Okay, we have one more question over here, and then we will break.
Hi, firstly, thank you for the lovely presentation. I kind of went into a full doctoral class mode, and I was like making a lot of notes. And then thank you, Ashish, you kind of completely turned it into a Black Mirror episode so quickly. And I hope that sets the tone for the next 2 days. But what I wanted to actually, there's so much to kind of unpack in this, and I was thinking about what you right now talked about, the long duration, the situational, international, the psychogeographic context, or the cyber psychogeography of it. Thinking about cartography as a kind of a mode of extended reality. So map making, and in a way, this is the context in which I'm also kind of thinking about technology as ways of kind of how to kind of move in a world that kind of augments and extends and mixes that which is not there with what is then augmented or added to. So meaning making that you talked about, you know, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between the real and then the data that is then both generated but also kind of produced, and the feedback loop that kind of happens. I'm also thinking about it from the context of like third order cybernetics suddenly, because you're talking about performance of both the feedback loop of the machine, the human, the machine, the technology, but also then the observed and the phenomena of the observation itself is kind of getting feedback looped into the entire situation. So not really questions, but just like.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I mean, it's interesting because in those tests, we're working with Lorenza Mondada. She's a quite well-known Swiss interactional linguist, and she's studied interaction in every kind of context you can imagine. And she's very fascinated. She had not she's not worked with these kinds of digital systems before. She's like studied things in the analog context, like how people buy croissants and cheese in stores, you know, but she sets up cameras everywhere. So she's looking at the camera as not objective, but let's say, you know, as the recorder of the reality, because we can't see all the kind of interaction rituals which are taking place without then going, and then she goes back and records with multiple cameras and then looks at all that footage and then has a transcription system where she transcribes the whole conversations taking place, both vocal but also all this other nonverbal interactions taking place. And those cameras are independent of the researchers. When she was in these tests, she had to put on this device. And it's very interesting. First she said, oh, you know, we have to set up situations where people will interact with each other just because they won't know what to do. And Philip Sermani, a colleague who's working on the project, who's also an ethnomethodologist, said, well, just wait and see what happens. Let's look at the situation, not what we imagine the situation to be, and see what happens. So even the way that like these virtual walls are set up where people don't really know what to do, like they sit there and like, okay, should I stand up? I see the people on the other side. Is there, like, am I supposed to do something? And then slowly they start to, because the graininess of the pass-through is one thing, and then they start seeing, oh, the person I'm seeing is getting fainter and faint. Are they, you know, and some people stand up and walk through the screen because they can, and other people sit there and say, oh, they're standing there as if the screen is there, you know. And the interesting thing is the researchers had to put these headsets on too. And so they're looking around, and the cameras, then they are recording what the cameras are seeing the other people do. So the researchers have to wear the camera. Well, I said then to Lorenza afterwards, I said, well, why did you look there and not there? And she said, well, that was interesting, but that wasn't under. I said, so now you're saying that the camera is not objective. You actually, as a researcher, are interfering with, and this is a classic question in ethnographic film of, well, what do you watch? Margaret Mead, of course, said in the 1930s in her debate with Gregory Bateson when they were working in Bali, you know, she said, this is an objective technology. We put the camera on the tripod and it records reality. But now you have the situation where you have to, what you're wearing is the reality that you decide to look at, you know? And so the cameras are looking at one reality, but the people wearing the headsets are looking at a different reality. And so then they all have to put all this together and synchronize and try to understand whose reality is being recorded, you know? And so this is very interesting because even though, again, we're supposed to think that this headset is supposed to record your point of view, they're trying to understand all the points of view taking place, because it may be that everyone's reality is actually different. I mean, one session happened, this one young Chinese woman, she made the problematic gesture of this, which you can't turn off, which when you do this with the HMD, with the Oculus, it turns the menu on, and you can't get rid of this feature. So the menu went on, and she went into some other space. And so, like, you know, she was in the waiting room, and you know, and other people were in the real space, and she was in a completely different space, and she had no idea. You know, so this is a good comment about the political situation of the world at the moment, right? Who's, you know, we think we're all in the same reality, but in fact, we're seeing very, very different things from our own perspective, and that own perspective then constructs that reality. It goes to also the anthropological question of performance. It's like why performance emerges in anthropology is because, well, performance is, you know, the performative mode is the construction of reality, as is what the core question in anthropology comes, like whose reality is being like shaped in that way. And so I think that brings up this extremely interesting question about what world are we in? Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Hello. Yes. So thank you so much, Chris, for kicking us off.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and also to Ashish for the amazing
with these very
commentary.
fundamental questions about sort of embodiment and subjectivity that I think will ground us through the next 2 days. And thank you to Ashish for the response and sort of framing it in terms of a set of political questions that are resonant here. We have a 15-minute break now, and then we will resume with a panel on infrastructures.